When talking about relations between Indonesia and the Netherlands, it is hard not to bring up history and dig up the past. While Indonesia is now a young and modern country that tends to look at the future, it must be acknowledged that Dutch history is also the history of the country's presence in the Indonesian archipelago for over 3 centuries. Until now, the cultural legacy of this colonization is still evident in Holland, especially when it comes to food and culinary tastes, as well as in the ancestral origin and experience of the people. Many Dutch people can trace a link with their former colony in their families and relatives. I asked Bernard Bot, a Dutch senior diplomat and former foreign minister, how relations between the two nations have evolved and how they should be framed today. Minister Bot, thank you for having me in your absolutely beautiful office now. You've recently won you got the Linggarjati award, and as somebody who's born before it became Indonesia. I mean, what's your sort of emotional take on the relations between the two countries in that aspect?
I think that, let's say, the way to go, of course, is, and I join very much what my Indonesian friends are always telling me. Listen, we are a people that is looking forward. Don't look too much backward. You know, what has happened has happened. We have offered our apologies on several occasions, and they were heartfelt apologies. Now let's see what we can do together in the future. And it is for that reason that Hassan Yuda and I, after this momentous celebration in Jakarta, said we have to make it more concrete. So we decided to set up a comprehensive partnership. I think if you talk about a partnership, it implies 2 partners, not only one. You know, in other words, I looked into the number of visits which we have paid to Indonesia, our ministers, you know, really defense minister, foreign minister, agricultural ministers, etc. But it should be mutually interested. In other words, also from Indonesia, Indonesian ministers, politicians, high-level officials should show interest in what's going on here. I think it can be fostered, for example, by a more intensive exchange of students. I think by political contacts, eventually, of course, by a visit of your president, which was cancelled, unfortunate moment, but quite understandable. But I think the time has come after all these recent visits that also the president of Indonesia, let's say, prepares for a visit, or, well, after the elections, I presume, so it will take a while. But what is important is already the intention to do so, because it's a signal of mutual interest, and I think that is what is important.
However, sometimes the pain of the past needs to be addressed properly before we can move on with a clean start. And in this case, perhaps a review of the more complex parts of the country's painful history should still be looked into. At least, that is what one Dutch historian I meet believes. Professor Henk, there is a sense that when we talk about Indonesian-Dutch relations, that the desire is to, let's look to the future, forget about the past and all its bitterness and sorrow and roller coaster relationship. But somehow we need to face the fact that we do have a long history behind us, and
we cannot ignore the past. Yes. We share a long and indeed also very complicated history, but we cannot turn our face just away and only look towards the future. I think we have reached a point that both countries are now old and wise enough to face that past as well, and to discover the past and also to learn from it.
Mm-hmm. Would you give us some of the highlights of the issues that are still perhaps in dispute or in denial or in conflict?
There's a very interesting case. If I may remind you of, say, the 1970s, 1980s. Indonesia, under the new order, received a lot of foreign aid, and the Netherlands played a key role in the IGGI, this committee. But there was also a Minister of Development Relationship, Jan Pronk, who was very critical and who tended to teach Indonesians how to develop, which was not always appreciated. So they felt, and one of my colleagues said, listen, Henk, we're not Suriname, you know, we're Indonesia, we're slightly bigger. So don't do that to us. And okay, we learned from that. And I think we, at a certain point, reached the point that we're now equal partners, which was, after the revolution, very difficult for the Dutch to accept. That Indonesia was now an independent country on the same level as Holland. The Dutch were unwilling, unable to accept that. But recently, there is a new interesting development. In Holland, there are more and more voices and reports, newspaper articles about Dutch atrocities during the revolution. So we proposed to do an in-depth investigation on the nature of military violence during the revolution. Because 100 to 300,000 Indonesian people were killed. And we should know and understand how that could happen. Interestingly enough, partly also on the advice of the Indonesian government, the Dutch government said, well, we better don't investigate that. The Dutch government will not support that because the Indonesians do not appreciate that. Because for a variety of reasons, I think, on the Indonesian part, they want to look at the future. So now we are in a position that we actually want to do something, and then the Indonesian government says, well, maybe you better don't do this. That's a very interesting, that's an interesting experience. So I can now understand how you felt in the 1970s when Pronk said, you should do this, you should do that. But this is not the way, I think, to approach history. We should both approach history, learn what happened in those dramatic years of the revolution, and understand what happened. And we, the Dutch and the Indonesians, were both involved. And I think if historians from both sides meet each other, talk with each other about it, and learn from each other, we understand each other much better.
Okay, economics, trade, and all these relations aside, there's also this emotional ties. Now, perhaps in the last few, especially the young generation, maybe they don't know much, or they don't have that emotional tie or memory about, us being part of the Dutch colony, for example. Now, but how is Indonesia, still being viewed in the Netherlands? Yes, is it something that's okay, that's part of the past, or does it still have this kind of nostalgic or emotional tie? That
1 in 10 Dutch people have a bond with Indonesia. Myself, my dad lived here for 30 years, my mom lived here for 10 years, long before I was born. So all the stories I heard in my youth were about Indonesia. So when I came to Soekarno-Hatta airport and I smelled the smell and I felt the climate, this was immediately all the positives I learned from my family. And all my brothers and sisters, I have 7 brothers and sisters, 6 of them were born in Indonesia. I'm the only one born in The Hague. So, and 10% of Dutch population has these direct emotions, ties. It is nostalgia to a certain extent. At the same time, it is a fantastic base to build this future relationship. Because, of course, the Indonesia of the 50s and 60s is not longer there. You have now developed into one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And we have had our developments in the Netherlands.
Just finally, on a final note, because I understand, I mean, you as a prime minister, in terms of age, you're relatively young, and also I hear that you like to teach, young people, and still on sort of this, the new generation or the generation of tomorrow, and a lot of the young Indonesians, for example, they look more towards the United States, for example. They may not have any kind of emotional ties with Holland. I mean, how to increase this sort of level of relationship between the young Indonesians and the youth of Holland, for example? What would make it interesting for Indonesian young kids to come to Holland?
Oh, to Holland. Well, I spoke with the alumni here. We are here in Erasmushuis in Jakarta. And I spoke here with the alumni who have studied in the Netherlands. 20,000 Indonesian students have come to the Netherlands and studied there. So I hope we will have many more to come. And we will send more and more Dutch students to Indonesia to get their university education at the very best Indonesian university. So also in the spirit of this equal partnership. For young people, I would say yes, America, fantastic. I love America. But I think when you view the world, there is so many countries have so much to offer. Europe has so much to offer in terms of its universities, education, its economy, it's orientated on the world like the Netherlands is itself, with a big harbor, with the export-oriented economy. So I think we have to work on all these issues at the same time. The economic bonds, trade, the political, the cultural ties, the sports, and then I believe we will remain relevant for each other, and that special bond will then move through the generations, also to the younger generations. And that's my hope and ambition.
And Indonesia-Dutch relations 3.0
and
in
then,
the future.
when we speak next time, 2.1, 2.2, and one day 3.0. But most definitely, that's the central focal point, the future-oriented.
Okay, Prime Minister, thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you, and I hope this is not your last visit, and hope to see you.
Certainly not, and thank you so much.
Here in the near future, and hope to you bring good stories about Indonesia to Holland.
I will, absolutely.
Okay, thank
you
you very
so
much.
Indonesians today are more familiar with English-speaking Western culture than that of the Dutch. As a matter of fact, other than words derived from the Dutch language, there's little that reminds Indonesians of their former colonial ties in everyday life. It is heartening, therefore, to meet Dutch professionals and young people who are not only interested in strengthening ties between the two countries, but who actively seek to expand relations and generate interest in Indonesia amongst the Dutch themselves. I talked to Jesse, president of Indonesia-Netherlands Society, as well as to Renee, who heads the youth version of that society and who had studied in Indonesia.
Now you've formed this Indonesia-Netherlands Youth Society. What do you hope to get out of it? And do you get a lot of young Dutch people interested in joining the society?
First of all, we hope to create friendships, because through friendships we believe countries are, their political relationship, bilateral relationship is based on friendship, people-to-people contact, I believe. So if on a youth level we can create friendships by connecting Indonesian students to Dutch students, when these people become older, become professionals, CEOs, politicians, they can stimulate the relationship in the future. So that is one of our main reasons, create dialogue and stimulate friendships.
How about you, Jesse? You've visited Indonesia quite a few times. What's your impression?
One of the things every time that I be there strike me is the enormous ambition to bring this country forward, and you see this ambition that it's not only growth for the matter of growth, but also sharing all these values and sharing the profits from growth with a larger and larger community. And so this energy, this power to change, I think has been the success of Indonesia in the past 10 years, and is also the base for the coming 20 years to build on.
The relationship between the Netherlands and Indonesia is indeed a complicated one. It's filled with memories of the past, with history, with a lot of emotional and cultural ties. However, it's also a relationship that has good hope for the future, for the two countries to really get to know each other again, but this time as partners. And that's all for this episode. Don't forget to join me next month when we meet another figure who makes a difference to our lives here on Face to Face with Daisy Anwar, bringing you the world.